You enter this coach with the power of your imagination. Beyond it is another dimension. A dimension of rails, of engines and trains. Yes, you're about to take a train ride straight into the unknown. A ride to the fringes of what we know to be reality. A ride to the very boundaries of science and superstition. Because we've given you a one-way express ticket into the railway zone. Edward woke up in a daze. His boiler was pulsating in pain. Perhaps he was a little bit rough the night before. And I say perhaps because Edward realized he couldn't remember the night before. All he remembered was speeding through Tidmouth, and the rest was a blank. But now what was demanding all of his attention was the fact that the shed he was in was unfamiliar. He'd never seen the place before. "How did I get here?" Edward asked his driver. But just as he finished his sentence, he realized his driver wasn't there. In fact, he seemed completely alone. However, his firebox was running, and he was able to pull out. Edward shrugged and puffed forward, bumping the shed doors in front of him. To his surprise, they came open extremely easily, and they felt extremely lightweight. When he bumped them, they made a slight tapping sound as if they were made of hollow plastic rather than the metal they resembled. Normally, when one walks outside, they expect to be hit in the face with a breath of fresh air, or at least to feel a difference in the air around them. But that's the thing. The air outside was just as still as the air inside the shed, and more to his dismay, there still wasn't a soul in sight. And yet, despite the loneliness, Edward started to get that eerie feeling of being watched. Edward sounded his whistle to hopefully grab someone's attention. A little girl's laughter. Edward heard it as clear as day. It was so loud, yet he couldn't discern exactly which direction it came from. It was just everywhere and nowhere. Given how old Edward was, he had traveled every single railway line in Great Britain at some point in his long life, and yet he couldn't recognize this particular area for the life of him. If anything, it hardly even looked British. To him, it looked more like the United States. And yet, as he made his way through the American-style city setting, he couldn't sense the presence of a single living soul. The city certainly looked big enough. So where was everybody? Suddenly, Edward's path was blocked. He came to a road crossing and found a large American-style station wagon parked across the tracks, although he couldn't quite make out the vehicle's make and model. It certainly had General Motors-esque styling to it, but he couldn't recognize it as any specific car he had ever seen. The car's windows were tinted so much he couldn't see inside it whatsoever. Edward blew his whistle, but the vehicle didn't move. Edward slowly approached the vehicle and lightly pushed it. Upon doing so, he made a shocking discovery. The car was fake. The soft tap it made when he made contact with it confirmed that it was made out of thin plastic, and the tires weren't even rubber. They too were plastic. It was like Edward was staring at one of those cheap, unlicensed toy cars you'd buy at a flea market, only it was the size of a real car. Edward was too disturbed and pushed the fake car out of his way. Around a bend, Edward saw a tree growing next to the tracks. Upon brushing against it, the whole tree collapsed and fell over. It was in that moment that Edward realized the tree wasn't even rooted into the ground. It was just a styrofoam mock-up of a tree. Everything around him was fake. fake cars, fake trees, and not a person for miles. Edward's sanity was slipping his grasp. He huffed and puffed along the line, trying to keep himself together. But then, he started to recall more of the previous night's events. He was chugging through Tidmouth at breakneck speed, but he wasn't just going fast for the hell of it. He was running from something, but he couldn't yet remember what he was running from. But then the chase was cut short when he took a turn too quickly and crashed, allowing whatever was chasing him to catch him. Certainly not the best night that an engine could have. But suddenly, he saw something that gave him a feeling of hope. Excitement filled his boiler as he noticed people standing ahead, next to another large American-style car. Finally, some life in this town. All he had to do was approach them, explain his predicament, and in hours he'd be sailing back to merry old England. He eagerly chugged up to them and prepared to greet them. But then he made a shocking discovery. The people were action figures. 2 action figures, the size of normal people, who had been propped up to look like they were conversing with each other. If Edward had any sanity left at this point, it escaped him then and there. Edward turned his throttle up as high as it would go, trying to flee the nightmare. He found himself screaming into the air as he fled the silent city, but in his craze, he once again neglected to notice a sharp turn fast approaching, which he was going much too fast to make. Edward cried, not just from the pain of the crash, but from the confusion and chaos around him. A whole world where everything is fake and there's no people, and he was trapped in it. "Someone!" he called. "I need a hand!" But as those words left his mouth, it hit him. Hand. He remembered what he was running from the night before. A giant hand poking out of the sky. Edward slowly turned his eyes to face the sky, and there stood the little girl who he'd heard giggling. There was only one problem. She wasn't little at all. An even taller figure emerged and spoke. "Enjoy your new toy train, dear. Your father brought it all the way from Earth."